Headache and letter. It was a late summer morning in St. Mary, and the sun poured gently through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room. The clock on the mantelpiece had just sounded 10. Normally by this hour, Miss Marple would be engaged in her embroidery or sorting through her correspondence with the same steady hands and sharp mind that had unpicked many a mystery in the past. But today was not like most days. Miss Marple was seated in her favorite armchair by the window that overlooked her modest rose garden. Despite the warm weather, she wore a shawl around her shoulders. Her expression, normally collected and slightly inquiring, was pinched with discomfort. One thin hand was lightly pushed on her temple. Her maid Clara, a no-nonsense young woman from the next hamlet, stood close with a scowl of concern. "Mom, you really should lie down," she advised. "That headache you have sounds terrible." Miss Marple, despite her years, answered with quiet resolution. "It isn't as bad as Clara says. Just a dull pain behind my eyes. There is nothing unusual, so there is no need for concern." Clara, not easily convinced, crossed her arms. "You didn't touch your tea and winced when the bell rang." Miss Marple gently shook her head. "You need rest, not a list of tasks." No, what I need is a remedy. That has helped 3 generations of women in my family. My grandma swore by it, and so did my mother. I'll write it down, and you must go acquire the ingredients for me from the market. You can find them all at Mrs. Cramley's stall. She still stocks those old herbs." Bless her heart, Clara hesitated and looked uncertain. "All right if you're sure, but you'll call me if it worsens." "Of course, dear," Miss Marple said, quickly grabbing for her pen and a scrap of note paper. She scrawled in her neat cursive, mumbling as she typed, 2 sprigs of wild chamomile, a pinch of ground cloves, and a touch of ginger root. Clara took the note, glanced at the list, and tucked it into her apron pocket. "Back in a jiffy, ma'am." Miss Marple smiled thinly. "And do tell Mrs. Crawley it's for me. She'll give you the correct batch." Clara nodded and quickly exited through the side door. Silence returned to the room, interrupted only by the gentle ticking of the clock and the rustling of a sparrow on the windowsill. Miss Marple reclined back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment. The agony was not excruciating, but it was constant, like a memory you want to forget but can't. She had just begun to drop into a light sleep when a sharp knock echoed from the front door. Her eyes opened at instantly. With a slight wince, she straightened in her chair and asked, in her clear senior voice, "Who is it?" A masculine voice instantly responded, "Postman, ma'am." Miss Marple sighed and went for her walking stick, but decided against it. "Come in," she said instead. The door creaked open, and in walked Mr. Douglas, the village postman, a stocky man in his 40s with wind-reddened cheeks and a cheerful manner, though today his smile was tinged with concern. "Morning, Miss Marple," he began as he approached, adjusting his cap. "You're not looking quite yourself today. You're very perceptive." "Douglas," Miss Marple said with a weak smile. "Indeed, I'm under the weather. Just a bit of a headache." "There's nothing dramatic still," he said, placing a single envelope on her lap. "You should take it easy. I got a letter here, and it appears urgent." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and inspected the envelope. Her heart gave a slight start as she noticed the handwriting. "It's from Mary," she murmured gently, almost to herself. "My beloved friend Mary Thompson. We were in school together, haven't heard from her in ages." She carefully opened the package, unfolded the sheet inside, and began to read. Her blue eyes quickly scanned the paper, and with each line, her expression transformed from mild astonishment to grave anxiety. The letter reads, "Marple, I'm quite worried. Please come promptly. My daughter and I have rented a new house, but something about it feels very strange and frightening. I can't fully put it in paper, but noises, shadows, unusual things. The place doesn't feel right. Please, I need you here. I trust your mind more than any inspector's badge. Yours, Mary. Miss Marple carefully folded the letter and looked up at the postman, her headache temporarily forgotten. Thank you, Douglas, she replied, her voice steady but distant. This is most helpful, and I dare say it's time I packed a small case. The postman, sensing a change in her tone, raised an eyebrow. Everything all right, miss? I hope so, she said faintly. But one never knows, do they? He nodded and gently let himself out, locking the door behind him. Clara returned, her cheeks flushed from the walk and her basket filled. Got it all, Mom? She exclaimed, holding out a small package of wrapped herbs and a bottle bearing Mrs. Crawley's familiar label. Miss Marple graciously accepted the goods. Quickly, Clara. I'll need a drink of water, and I have to depart shortly. Something urgent has occurred, Clara blinked. You're leaving, but you're not well. I was. Miss Marple stated, measuring out the contents of the remedy with experienced accuracy. However, one does not neglect a friend in need. Mary's in trouble. If I'm not mistaken, this is a serious problem. And if I know anything about Mary, she wouldn't have written in such a state unless she meant every word. Clara brought the water and lingered uncomfortably while Miss Marple drank the bitter concoction, with a wrinkled nose and firm jaw. Then, with surprising vigor for a woman of her years, Miss Marple stood from her chair and began gathering her belongings. A small handbag, a fresh pair of gloves, her second-best hat, and the folded letter. I'll need the next train to Elkham, she said to herself rather than Clara. I believe Mary suggested moving there last Christmas. However, what if your headache returns? Miss Marple turned to the door and smiled sweetly. If it does, Clara, I will remind it that responsibility comes first. And with that, she strolled out into the cool air of St. Mary Me, where the roses were still blooming, the church bell chimed every quarter hour, and the germ of a fresh mystery had quietly taken root. Chapter 2. The Flower Bed on the Balcony. The train chugged out from the small rural station with a sluggish metallic groan as Miss Marple stepped onto the platform, her gloved hands neatly folded over the handle of her bag. A gentle breeze danced with the brim of her hat, and the perfume of wild flowers wafted in the air, creating a deceptively serene environment given the contents of the letter that invited her here. Miss Marple stood still for a moment to gather her bearings. Then, with calm determination, she began walking towards Mary's home. According to the letter, the address was only a 5-minute walk from the station. Her memory served her well. The Kunta, modest white house with blue shutters, appeared exactly where it should have been, tucked on a quiet lane bordered with bushes and gravel walks. It was a modest cottage that would be described as attractive in a rental brochure, but a closer glance revealed chipping paint on the shutters and a faint sag in the wooden gate. Miss Marple reached the front door and knocked politely, her fingertips creating a delicate yet definitive sound against the wood. The door cracked open, and there stood Mary. When she saw her visitor, her eyes widened and she burst into tears. Tears flowed down her cheeks as her voice trembled with relief. "Oh, Marple," she muttered, her shoulders quivering. Miss Marple, though startled, remained composed. She took a step closer and gently placed her hand on Mary's arm. There, she said quietly. "Come now, let's go inside and talk properly." Mary nodded tearfully as she led the way into the sitting room. The interior was as modest as the facade, with sparse furnishings, cream-colored draperies, and a slight aroma of lavender polish in the air. Miss Marple looked in everything with her usual careful observation. The half-burned candle on the mantel, the uneven carpet, the fresh but worried attempt at homeliness. They sat opposite from one another, and Mary blotted her eyes with a crumpled handkerchief. "You already know," she continued with a trembling voice, "that my daughter Jennifer was studying medicine. Her tests are now over, and she has qualified as a junior doctor. She was offered a position at the General Hospital, which is only 10 minutes away. It seemed like an ideal chance." Miss Marple nodded patiently. So you moved here to be close? Yes, we rented this property, Mary replied, looking around as if the walls were listening. At first, it seemed great affordable near the hospital calm. But shortly after we settled there, I began to feel restless. There is something about this place. Marple something I can't quite explain. Jennifer is gone all day, and sometimes all night with her shifts, leaving me alone here, and when I'm alone, I feel it the most. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Mary paused, then said, "Come with me. I'll show you." She led Miss Marple through the narrow corridor and out onto its small balcony at the back of the home. The view should have been pleasant. An open yard with a line of trees in the distance and the distant form of the hospital. Over the fields. But Miss Marple's attention was quickly drawn to the object in the middle of the balcony. A vast raised flower garden flanked by bricks and filled with thick dark dirt. Though a few neglected pansies and marigold struggled for life at its corners, the middle was barren. Miss Marple frowned. There were no blossoms or evidence of growth. In such a little home, why plant such a massive flower bed here and exactly in the center? It obstructs everything, the space and the light. One could have built it against the railing or in a corner, but this is intentional. Mary nodded grimly. That's what struck me too, so I asked the landlord about it. He stated removing it would cost too much. He told me very coldly that if I wanted it gone, I would have to pay for it myself. Miss Marple puckered her lips. Charming dude sounds like a miser who isn't really imaginative with his lies. Mary turned her eyes wide. Marple, it scares me. Not only because it is unusual, but because of how I feel about it. Some days when I sit in the parlor and the back door is ajar, I hear sounds of a faint scratching like something moving in the soil. I go outside and there's nothing, but I know I heard something. Miss Marple moved slowly around the bed, checking the edges. Her gaze lingered on a patch of disturbed soil, as if something had been recently planted or unearthed. I see, she said. Quietly, so let's speak to your landlord. Mary did not need convincing. Within an hour, the two women stood in the tiny office of Mr. Lionel Brooks, the landlord of the property. A balding man in his late 50s with a faded checked waistcoat and spectacles placed too low on his nose. He looked up from his papers with barely veiled displeasure. "Oh, Miss Thompson and your aunt, is this a friend?" Miss Marple corrected him sweetly but firmly. "Jane Marple." "Right, what can I do for you?" Mary began to explain, but Miss Marple stepped in, her tone diplomatic yet pointed. "We've come to discuss the flower bed on the balcony. It serves no beneficial purpose and occupies a large amount of space in what is already a somewhat constrained location. Most importantly, it disrupts the tenant's peace of mind." Mr. Brooks shrugged. "As I previously stated, tearing it out would cost more than it was worth. If she wants to get rid of it, she is free to do so, but I will not pay for it." Miss Marple watched him for a moment and said softly, "I suggest a compromise. You pay half of the expense, and we will arrange for the removal and construction of a new bed along the side wall. It would be more functional and much more tasteful." Brooks sniffed. "That flower bed's been lucky for me. I've never had trouble letting the place while it's been there." Miss Marple's voice cooled just slightly. "I do not believe in such superstition, Mr. Brooks, and I feel your renter's comfort should come before abstract conceptions of luck." The landlord stared at her for a long time, and something in her steady blue eyes disturbed him. He cleared his throat. "I suppose if we split the cost, it could be arranged." Miss Marple smiled ever so slightly. "Very sensible. We'll have someone assess it tomorrow." As they walked back to the house, Mary looked at Miss Marple with open gratitude. "You handled him brilliantly." Miss Marple shrugged modestly. "One only needs to press the right buttons." Chapter 3. Bones beneath the petals. The morning air in the small village was crisp, but the sky remained stubbornly gray, with low clouds clinging to the rooftops like a hesitant fog. On the short balcony, at the back of Mary's leased home, The air had taken on a terrible sickly weight that no weather could explain. Carl, a local laborer, arrived just after breakfast, summoned to help remove the strangely placed flower bed Miss Marple and Mary had questioned days earlier. With a spade in hand and a cigarette tucked behind one ear, he approached the task with the casual confidence of someone used to gardening. Miss Marple stood off to the side, her gaze fixed on the center of the balcony with disconcerting intensity. Mary stood just inside the doorway, nervously wringing her hands. Carl grunted as he drove the shovel into the soil, scraping out clumps of soggy earth. "Strange place for a flower bed," he murmured. "Blocks the light. Waste of valuable balcony. Space," he continued digging. The dirt was shockingly dense, packed tighter than garden soil should be. After several shovels of earth had been removed, the edge of something rough and gray emerged fabric. Perhaps Carl bent down and brushed aside the soil with gloved hands. "What in God's name?" He mumbled. It was a sack, a huge burlap sack knotted firmly at the top and stained darkly in spots. The instant the cooled air reached it, a dreadful stink broke forth, strong, rotten, and clearly organic. Mary gasped, turning aside and covering her lips. Miss Marple's face stiffened, but did not flinch. Carl gingerly attempted to remove the sack, but the moist fabric gave way with a terrible rend. Bones yellowed brittle and shattered spilled out. Onto the ground, a femur rolled over the damaged tiles and halted near Miss Marple's shoes. Carl stumbled back. "Dear Lord, that is a body." Mary let out a frightened sob. Miss Marple went forward, her voice calm yet quiet. "Do not touch anything further." Mary called the police right away. Pale and shaking, Mary hurried to the phone. The inspector came within half an hour, escorted by 2 uniformed constables and a plainclothes officer carrying a forensic kit. The group rushed quickly, securing the area and ordering everyone off the balcony. A police line was constructed through the back door, and neighbors began looking out of their curtains. Miss Marple sat quietly in the parlor, drinking a cup of tepid tea Mary had shakily poured. When the inspector, a tall man with short hair and piercing eyes, entered the room, she stood and respectfully offered her hand. "Inspector, I'm Miss Jane Marple. I assume Mary has already phoned this in, but I would be happy to provide more explanation." The inspector nodded, noticing her collected posture. "Please do." Miss Marple nodded for him to sit. "Mary Thompson is a longtime friend of mine. She moved into this property with her daughter Jennifer." The flower bed on the balcony was exceedingly peculiar. Its size, placement, and condition were all inconsistent with typical use. We gained reluctant consent from the landlord to have it removed. During that removal, your personnel discovered the remains. "I noticed," the inspector said thoughtfully, "and the landlord, whose name is James, should be contacted at immediately." James arrived shortly after, his shirt open at the collar, sweat gleaming on his brow despite the cold day. When he spotted the police tape, he asked the inspector immediately, "Mr. James, I understand you own this property. What can you tell me about that flower bed?" James moved awkwardly. "Look, I've been renting this home for years. I don't really keep track of every detail. I just come by once a month to collect the rent. But the flower bed," the inspector pushed, "did you create it? Do you know who did?" James scratched his neck, avoiding eye contact. "Not me. It was already there when the last occupants departed. That would have been 3 years ago, when there were 2 guys living here, John and Joseph. Joseph was John's nephew, but you wouldn't know it with only a year or 2 between them. They got along like friends, kept to themselves, and usually paid their rent on time." Miss Marple, who had remained silent until now, spoke gently. "Do you remember how and why they left?" James nodded. "Joseph said they both found jobs in the city and stopped by one afternoon to say they'd be moving out. They packed up and departed without a fuss." Though the inspector narrowed his eyes, Joseph was a weird person. He had a preoccupation with magic, the occult, or something like that. Always reading odd literature, a bit of a loner. He built the flower bed 2 days before they departed, and I had no idea until he was finished. He told me and vowed to me that it was a present, that the flower bed would bring me luck and that the house would never be empty. Did you believe him? The inspector asked. One brow lifted. James offered a shaky laugh. I don't know. I thought he was a lunatic, but I didn't question it. It was a flower garden. It didn't seem worth the hassle. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Was there anyone else living here after John and Joseph? James nodded again. Yes, a young couple with a baby remained for approximately 6 months. The inspector took out his notepad. Do you have addresses for them or John and Joseph? Yes, I do, James responded while fumbling with a folder. Before this, Joseph and John were staying in the next hamlet over, and I have that address as well. He gave over the material to the inspector, who briefly read it before turning to Miss Marple. Would you be willing to come along and help with the questions? Miss Marple shook her head slowly. I'm afraid my health isn't what it used to be. Inspector, I believe you'll do well enough without me, but I would prefer it if you kept me updated. The inspector offered a courteous nod. Of course, in the interim, we will send those bones for DNA analysis. That should reveal who they belong to and perhaps what happened to them. Outside, the forensic team began their grisly task, meticulously placing the remains in sealed evidence bags. The air was thick with anxiety, and even the birds were restrained. Mary sat in a corner of the sitting room, pale and silent. Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I believe, Mary, she whispered softly. Something extremely dark was hidden in your balcony. Secrets, not bones, decay in the earth until someone digs them out. Mary shuddered. Do you think this is murder? Miss Marple's gaze remained on the balcony door. We'll know shortly, but I don't believe in coincidences. Not when a flower bed appears overnight with a body hidden beneath it. As the police car holding James drove away and the inspector began preparing to track the tenants of the past, Miss Marple returned to her chair, her expression as peaceful as usual. However, beneath those lovely features, her mind worked tirelessly, churning over the timeline. The names, the awkward silences, whatever secrets this peaceful house held. Miss Marple knew one thing. They had begun to speak again, and she, as always, would listen. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past. The early air in the village was quiet and thick, laced with the aroma of soil disturbed too thoroughly. Miss Marple sat alone by the broken pieces of the flower bed in the back of Mary's small rented home. The forensic team had leveled the earth and now marked it with a simple cord and a wooden post. The silence that pervaded the place was not peaceful. It was the silence of something unresolved. Miss Marple sat in silent thought, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the patch of dirt as if it could still tell secrets. She'd seen too much in her life to dismiss anything as a coincidence. A forceful knock on the side gate interrupted her quiet. Miss Marple, called a familiar voice. It was Inspector Graves. She rose slowly, not out of age, but from careful consideration, and turned to greet him. He stepped closer, holding his notebook in one hand and resting the other in his coat pocket. You've come early, Miss Marple said softly, walking him around the side of the house to the back. That usually means new developments. I thought I'd give you an update in person, Graves answered, darting a glance at the ruined flower bed. We recently obtained early results from the hospital's pathology team. Miss Marple's eye has narrowed slightly. Go on. The bones are clearly human as we expected. They belong to a male, most likely between the ages of 25 and 30. The remains are too degraded for us to ascertain the cause of death right once, although there are no visible evidence of blunt force trauma, at least not yet. Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised but listening closely. There's more? Graves continued, lowering his voice somewhat. I paid a visit to the family who lived here before. Mary and her daughter. They were a young couple with an infant at the time I asked if anything about the house had ever struck them as odd. And what did they say, Miss Marple? They stated that the flower bed constantly made them feel anxious. The husband informed me that when they stepped onto the balcony, it seemed like something was amiss. He stated their dog used to growl at it and wouldn't go near it. Eventually, the wife refused to set foot on the balcony at all, which forced them to leave. Miss Marple gave a tiny nod. People frequently perceive what they can't see, even if they don't understand it. The inspector appeared slightly unnerved by her serene assurance, but pressed on. I also followed up on our earlier lead, meeting with the families of John and Joseph, the two men who lived here before that couple. They have not heard from one of them in over 3 years. No letter, no phone call, nothing for 3 years. Miss Marple muttered, as if tasting the weight of the number. Graves took a seat alongside her on the small garden bench. Their family imagined they had simply moved on and faded away. But around 6 months after the last contact, both families became apprehensive and filed missing person reports. Local police did all they could, but there was no trace. No bank activity. No work records, no sightings. They disappeared. Miss Marple turned to him with her compassionate but razor-sharp eyes. "And did you ask them where John and Joseph worked?" "I did," the inspector replied, flipping through his notes. Both were employed at a local manufacturing firm, Arkwell Instruments. It's about 4 miles from here. An old warehouse turned into a precise engineering facility. They worked in the maintenance division, and their occupations were a shift-based. Yes, mostly night hours. The corporation kept quiet about it at the time, but apparently the two had complained about some sort of internal conflict. Nothing official, just little arguments. The families didn't think much of it. Miss Marple's fingers gently drummed on the arm of the bench. "You should go there, Inspector. Speak with their manager. Find out who last saw them. Ask if anybody else left unexpectedly." Sometimes what individuals don't say is the most telling. Graves exhaled. "You know, Miss Marple, I've worked with Scotland Yard for more than a decade, but I've never met anyone who can see so much in the gaps between facts." She offered a weak smile. "Knitting teaches you one loose thread and everything unravels. This flower bed serves as the thread, Inspector. We haven't pulled it far enough yet." There was a moment of quiet between them, interrupted only by the slight rustle of the leaves. Above Graves stood, "I'll pay a visit to Arkwell Instruments this afternoon. If there's anything there, I'll discover it." Miss Marple gazed up at him with a touch of tenderness in her eyes. "Be cautious of what they choose to remember." As the inspector departed, Mary walked onto the balcony with 2 cups of tea, her face pale but serene. She offered one to Miss Marple and sat alongside her. "Did he mention anything new?" Mary said gently. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, the bones belong to a guy in his late 20s, and both of the men who lived here before your previous tenants. John and Joseph disappeared around the same time that flower bed was erected." The flower bed no longer looked like a simple curiosity. It had become a grave, and as Miss Marple was well aware, most graves rarely remained silent for long. Somewhere, someone remembered what had happened and possibly scared that it was now being exposed. And that was always the most hazardous stage of a mystery, when it begins to wake. Chapter 5. The Missing Resignation. Inspector Graves hadn't spoken to Miss Marple for 2 days. The concern at the discovery of human bones beneath the flower bed had not diminished. If anything, the mystery had increased, spreading like a creeping fog over every facet of John and Joseph's backgrounds. When the inspector arrived to Mary's rented house in the afternoon, he discovered Miss Marple sitting by the window facing the garden, as usual. A little notebook was next her teacup, and her knitting needle sat quietly in her lap. She looked up with calm curiosity as he arrived. "You've been busy," she murmured with a tiny nod. Graves gave a tired but deliberate smile and took the seat across from her. "Yes, and I've come with more threads to unwind." "Let us hear them," Miss Marple said, folding her hands softly. "I went to the place where John and Joseph used to work, and the inspector started. Arkwell Instruments is a small manufacturing unit. I asked to talk to the manager, Mr. Kelman." He remembered Joseph very clearly. He opened his notebook and read aloud. According to Kelman, Joseph submitted his resignation letter abruptly. Kelman informed him that corporate policy demanded at least a month's notice or he would not receive his final salary. Joseph answered, and I quote, "I don't care. I don't need the money." Miss Marple lifted an eyebrow. Odd. That type of dissociation from wage frequently indicates either trust in a new revenue source or a more desperate reason to depart. Precisely, Graves agreed, and Kelman asked him if John would also be departing. Joseph answered, yes, John was also going. So the manager inquired, "Where's John's resignation letter?" Joseph promised him John would submit it personally, but John never did, and he never returned at all. Miss Marple's look became more thoughtful. So Joseph quits legally without caring about his income, and John disappears silently without so much as a signature on paper. This does not seem like a planned joint exit. It sounds like just one of them wanted to depart, exactly, Graves remarked. That opens up a very real possibility. Miss Marple, the bones we discovered possibly belong to John. Miss Marple's eyes clouded for a moment, and Joseph never mentioned John again after leaving the company. The inspector said, "Nothing at all." I followed up with some of their colleagues. One of them, Tara, stated that Joseph had become increasingly reclusive in the weeks leading up to his resignation. She also said he was enamored with photography and spoke about it often. Apparently, after leaving Arkwell, he launched a little photographic business. Did he miss? Marple asked, intrigued. Yes, with a man named George. The two of them tried to start a photo studio in town, but the firm folded in less than 2 months. There was no formal closure, just vanished. Miss Marple tapped a finger softly on the table, which is extremely informative. Someone leaves solid employment, walks away from compensation, and launches a passion project that fails nearly immediately. Graves leaned in. One could suspect bad planning or guilt. What do you mean? Miss Marple's voice was quiet yet deliberate. People burdened by a dark deed frequently go towards something that feels pure art, photography, music. They seek absolution or even distraction, but if the deed pursues them as it usually does, the escape fails. Graves glanced at her in admiration. You make murder sound like poetry. Miss Marple said, I'm not convinced yet that Joseph is a murderer. I'm just confident that he is the key. The inspector agreed. You're right, which is why I'm going to find George and speak with him. Miss Marple stated, you must question him everything, including how they met, who offered the idea, and why it failed. Graves jotted notes. I will, miss. Marple's tone shifted slightly. And following that, I believe you should visit the school where John and Joseph attended. The school, she continued. You'd be amazed how many secrets begin in youth. Rivalries, connections, and resentments. If they were close from a young age, the school might have records of academic difficulties, disciplinary concerns, or even staff who remember them. Especially if Joseph had a darker disposition, it may have been obvious early on. Graves admitted, I'll go there after I find George. Miss Marple gave a slightly satisfied smile. Sometimes, Inspector, to solve a murder in the present, you must unearth a character from the past. Chapter 6. The Girl in the Photograph. It was late afternoon when Inspector Graves came to Mary's cabin again. The shadows on the garden wall stretched long and thin, and the broken flower bed in the balcony still carried a silent danger, even after the bones it formerly harbored were carted away. Miss Marple, sitting as often in the small parlor with her embroidery half finished, looked up as the inspector arrived. The piercing sparkle in her eyes suggested that she had expected him. You've been to see George, she replied without pause. Graves took off his coat and sat down. Yes, and it was quite the conversation. He opened his notebook but did not need it. His recollection, honed by the twists of the case, was vivid. I questioned George why the photographic business he established with Joseph terminated so abruptly. He didn't hesitate. He stated Joseph was erratic, a peculiar fellow who seldom worked. He only cared about his girlfriend. Florence spent all of the money we generated on her. I was the one doing the sessions, creating prints, and handling the accounting. He merely talked big and disappeared when it came time to actually operate the place. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. Florence echoed. So Joseph has a girlfriend? Indeed, the inspector remarked. That's when I decided to delve a little more. I went to the school where Joseph and John attended. The staff there were helpful. They confirmed that Florence was indeed a schoolmate of Joseph's, his close friend, apparently from quite early on. The type of attachment that tends to spark teenage conflict. He flipped to a page in his notebook. They told me Joseph got into several fights with boys at school, all over Florence. She appeared to have received a lot of attention, and Joseph, being possessive, responded harshly. Miss Marple sipped her tea carefully, letting the facts settle. And John, was he engaged in any of these incidents? No, Graves replied. There was a 1-year gap between the two. Joseph was in the senior class. John was in the class below. But from what I gathered, John looked up to Joseph a lot. Some of the teachers recalled them as close, nearly inseparable outside the classroom. However, one teacher mentioned a falling out between them just before they left school. Nobody understood why Miss Marple's fingers paused above her stitching thread. Friendships that become sour in adolescence frequently have lengthy shadows, especially when love is involved. As Graves stated, I didn't stop there. I spoke with numerous residents from the neighborhood where the two lived before moving into the rental property. Several older residents remembered them. They said they had frequently seen John and Joseph together, occasionally with a young woman. He leaned forward. I asked them for descriptions, and based on what they stated, I feel the young woman could have Florence. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her expression pondering. She could very well be the key. If she was close to Joseph and perhaps also to John, she may know what happened to them. That's what I was thinking as well, Graves said, especially because no one has heard from either man in 3 years. If Florence is still alive, she may be the only one who can tell us if Joseph fled or is buried under that flower bed. Miss Marple set down her cup. You must locate her, Inspector, but tread gently. If she's hiding something, she might already be thinking of methods to cover it up. Graves stood. I'll start to work on it immediately. I've already requested the local council offices for any recent records, property, employment, even clinic visits under her name, with hope something will turn up. He went for his coat but halted. There's one more thing I need to stop by the hospital. The DNA report on the bones has arrived, and I'm going to get it right now. Miss Marple looked up, her demeanor controlled, but her voice steely. That report may tell us who the victim is, but it won't tell us why. True, Graves answered gently, but it will help us narrow the story. He hesitated at the entrance. You're still convinced this wasn't random? Quite, Miss Marple stated firmly. No one buries a body beneath a flower bed on a balcony unless they're hiding something really private. I believe the perpetrator knew the victim well and may still be within reach. The inspector gave her a little nod. I will return as soon as I get something. Chapter 7. Truths Beneath the Surface. The late morning light flowed softly through the windows of Mary's sitting room, putting a warm glow on the tea table where Miss Marple sat wrapped in her pale blue shawl. Despite her controlled face, the small creases around her eyes were drawn tighter than normal. The weight of what was to come hovered in the room like a brewing storm. There was a steady pounding on the door, and Mary peeked out from the hallway and answered it. Inspector Graves walked in, hat in hand, his countenance serious. Miss Marple, he said. The DNA forensic report is back. She folded her hands neatly in her lap. And it's confirmed, he gently responded. The bones we found under the flower bed, they belong to John. There's no doubt about it. Now there is. For a long period there was silence. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly and nodded. Thank you for telling me in person, the inspector said. There's more. I found information about Florence. She is currently employed as a manager at Bexley and Company, just outside the hamlet, and I intend to see her soon. Miss Marple's eyes became alert. Wait, I'll come with you. Graves appeared astonished. Are you sure? Last time. My health is better today, she declared firmly. And I have questions of my own for Miss Florence. They departed together in the inspector's car. The winding roads, lined by yellowing hedges and the occasional glimpse of grazing sheep, the countryside rolled past placid and indifferent, despite the keen stream of stress flowing beneath their voyage. Bexley and Company was a modest, smart-looking administrative office, hidden behind a neat row of stores. After verifying the schedule, the receptionist brought them to a glass-paneled office where Florence sat at a polished desk, pounding on a computer keyboard. She looked up, her demeanor neutral. She was a well-dressed young woman of perhaps 28, with clear, composed features and a professional bearing. Yes, she inquired politely. Miss Florence, Inspector Graves replied. I'm Inspector Graves from the local police. This is Miss Jane Marple. We would like to speak with you for a few minutes. Florence motioned for them to seat. Of course. What is this about? Miss Marple was the first to speak. Do you know two young men by the names of John and Joseph? Florence nodded slowly. Yes, I do. Joseph was my friend. We were even engaged. And John was part of the same circle. Were you close with both of them? Graves inquired, his tone. Even if I was close to Joseph, she responded carefully. John was more of a friend, like a brother. Miss Marple's keen eyes noticed the glint of a ring on Florence's left hand. Simple gold, simple but unmistakable, worn on the engagement finger. She leaned forward slightly. Are you still waiting for Joseph? Florence blinked and followed Miss Marple's eyes to the ring. She offered a quiet, brief laugh. Oh, I'm only wearing this piece for fashion now. We were engaged. Yes, but it was 3 years ago. He and John departed shortly after I attempted to locate Joseph, but he vanished. Miss Marple's voice remained soft yet firm. Several people have reported seeing you with both John and Joseph on numerous occasions. Are you certain there wasn't more between you and John? Florence's jaw tightened. People say terrible things, Miss Marple. They enjoy gossiping, but it is not true that I was only ever with Joseph. John was like a sibling to me. That was all. Miss Marple exchanged glances with the inspector. Then she said, quietly and clearly, John is dead. We discovered his remains hidden beneath a flower bed. Florence's composure crumbled. Her lips opened, and the color drained from her face. What? She gasped. His bones were recently discovered in a house that both he and Joseph once rented, Graves continued. The DNA confirmed it this morning. For a few seconds Florence sat still, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. Her voice quivered as she eventually said, John is dead. Are you sure where Joseph is? Miss Marple said, We have not located Joseph yet. Florence's face showed a spark of fear, bewilderment, or possibly guilt. She opened her lips to speak before closing it again. Her hands shook slightly as she went for the water glass beside her. I don't know what to say, she mumbled. Miss Marple stood. You have said enough for now, Miss Florence, but I recommend you stick near. The past has a way of catching up, even when you think it has been buried. The inspector gave her a nod. We may have more questions soon. Florence offered a slight, preoccupied nod. I will be here. Outside, the air felt heavier and heavy with everything unsaid. The sun had begun to set behind the buildings, throwing long shadows on the pavement. Miss Marple walked quietly beside the inspector, her feet slower than usual. I'm afraid, she murmured softly, I must leave the rest to you for now. My strength isn't what it was, and I'm going back to Mary's house to recover." Graves glanced at her with concern. "You've done more than enough, Miss Marple. I will take it from here." She offered him a weak smile. "Do find Joseph, Inspector, because one of two things is true. He vanished to escape something, or someone helped him vanish after doing something unforgivable." The inspector watched her carefully go back to the car, her petite figure framed by the fading light. Despite her age and apparent frailty, Jane Marple moved like someone who had seen far more than she let on, and understood it all more deeply than most ever would. As the engine purred to life and drove her back across the peaceful countryside, Miss Marple sat in silence, her mind going over every detail of the visit. A dead man, a missing fiancé, and a woman with a ring for no one. The threads were tightening, and the truth was finally emerging. Chapter 8. The truth in the parlor, 3 days after their last meeting. Inspector Graves came to Mary's cottage. The wind had risen up somewhat, rustling the leaves outside and brushing tiny patterns on the window panes. Miss Marple sat in the room with a shawl wrapped over her shoulders. Mary poured tea softly in the background, understanding the severity of what might happen next. Her eyes were alert and observant. The inspector removed his hat with a weary grimace. "We have still been unable to uncover any information regarding Joseph. It's like he disappeared." Miss Marple gazed up with tranquil confidence. "That's because you're looking in the wrong area. I know where Joseph is." The chambers stilled. Graves was caught off surprise and blinked. "Take me to Florence's house." Miss Marple spoke gently, folding her hands in her lap. "And bring the landlord James with you." The inspector's brow furrowed. "James, yes," she replied. "There's something he should hear." Graves promptly organized a small police force. Within 1 hour, Miss Marple, James, and 2 uniformed officers were en route to Florence's modest cottage. In the nearby village of Wexcombe, the sky above was somber, draped with heavy gray clouds, as if nature itself predicted what was about to be revealed. The automobile stopped in front of a 2-story brick house with nicely manicured hedges. Curtains twitched inside. Graves directed his players to surround the sides. Miss Marple went out cautiously, the wind tugging at her scarf as she steadied herself. They knocked. Footsteps approached from within. A man opened the door. He was in his early 30s, unshaved and wearing a casual shirt. The moment his eyes met the police uniforms, panic overcame him. He rushed without saying a word. "Stop!" Graves shouted. The man raced down the garden path, but he didn't make it far. Before he could reach the corner of the street, 2 officers pushed him to the ground. Graves stepped up, panting slightly. "Why were you trying to run?" Miss Marple came forward, her voice steady. "Because this man is Joseph, and he understands that the truth of his crime cannot be hidden for much longer." The man, breathing deeply, sought to keep his composure. "I have not committed any crime." Miss Marple stared him directly in the eye. "You murdered your nephew John and buried him under the flower bed at the house you previously rented. To hide your tracks, you told the landlord James that the flower bed would bring good luck and that it was a present for him." James, who had stood quietly until now, gasped. "You stated that it would bring renters and keep the house successful." Miss Marple turned towards James. "When Joseph returned the house keys to you after moving out, was John accompanying him?" James hesitated. No, John wasn't there. I believed he had already departed." Miss Marple nodded. "Joseph had already killed him. John never left. He was buried behind the flower bed, which you thought was lucky." Joseph screwed his face in protest. "That's not true. I didn't kill anybody." Miss Marple remained undeterred. "Your school records give a clear image of your temperament. Short-tempered, compulsive, possessive, especially towards Florence. Noticed John developing feelings for her. Maybe she responded those feelings even marginally, and you couldn't stomach it." She paused. "You were possessive of her even back then. You battled boys at school. because of her. And 3 years ago you eliminated what you viewed as a threat, your own nephew. I told you, Joseph snapped, I didn't kill him. Graves crossed his arms and looked towards Miss Marple. We'll investigate more, but explain me how you knew Joseph was at Florence's house. Miss Marple smiled kindly. When we visited Florence earlier, I noticed she was still wearing the engagement ring Joseph gave her 3 years ago. No one wears a ring that long, especially one tied to a man who has disappeared, unless they're still emotionally or physically connected to that person. She continued, Florence said she wore it for fashion, but it was more than that, her body language, her discomfort. It told me she was hiding something. So I assumed that Joseph had never actually left. He was hiding in plain sight with the only person he believed could still protect him. Florence, who appeared during the excitement, was paralyzed in her doorway. Florence, Miss Marple whispered softly. Don't you like to tell the truth now? Florence's lips twitched. Her gaze flew between Joseph the policeman and Miss Marple. I didn't kill John, she explained, her voice shaking. He was like a brother to me. She paused, swallowed hard, and continued. But Joseph, his rage ruined everything. She looked down, humiliated. One night, Joseph came to my door unexpectedly, shivering and scared. He told me he killed John because they had battled over me. He claimed John accused him of being possessive and jealous, and then Joseph snapped. He buried John under the flower bed and made up a tale about it being lucky. The inspector's expression darkened. And you didn't report it. I was afraid, she muttered. You begged me to let him stay. He promised not to reveal who he really was. I wasn't sure what to do. Fear, as Miss Marple softly stated, is often the first chain in a very long incarceration. The police immediately arrested Joseph for John's murder, and Florence was also detained for harboring a fugitive and obstructing justice. As the officers escorted the pair away, Miss Marple stood quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The clouds were starting to split. Later that evening, she returned to Mary's house. Mary opened the door, looking distraught. You're back, she asked. What happened? It's over, Miss Marple replied simply. John's killer has been apprehended, and justice will follow. Mary's eyes began to flood with tears. I've decided to leave this house. I can't stay here anymore, knowing what lay beneath the very place I sat each day. Miss Marple took her hand. That is wise. Some places carry echoes. It's best not to live with them. Mary grasped her hand strongly. Thank you for believing in me and supporting me when no one else could. Miss Marple grinned. Sometimes the smallest of queries lead to the most profound truths. With her work completed and her health restored, Miss Marple returned to her own cottage in St. Mary's. The next morning, the roses were still in bloom, and her garden chair was waiting beneath the arbor. She resumed her knitting where she had left off, her needles clicking gently while the community went about its tranquil day. Another mystery was solved, another secret was brought to light, and Miss Marple remained calm and firm, waiting for the next whisper that may reach her from behind lace curtains or through the flutter of hedgerows in a village that never kept silent for long.